Right, good afternoon, colleagues. As I said earlier, I do feel very slightly that Jayan and I sitting up here with you all down there are kind of setting ourselves up for having tomatoes or something like that thrown at us. Well, I'm sure it'll be at me, not at Jayan. Anyway, it's a very great pleasure to welcome Jayan. I think I should say back to ISAS, because I think I'm right in saying you're actually the first ever research fellow of ISAS.
I believe so.
Going back to, would it be
2005?
2005, right.
1st March 2005.
So welcome back. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome Jayan, or welcome Jayan back to the Institute, because I think we've known each other a bit for quite a long time, certainly since you were doing your PhD at IDR in Bombay. And as I think a number of colleagues will know, Jayan has done a lot of research and written quite extensively on aspects of India's industrial economy and on employment matters, including quite a big paper in the EPW on employment just a little over a year ago, and very recently a shorter paper on the topic of this afternoon's presentation. So Jayan, you're very welcome.
Yeah, over to you. Thank you so much. It's almost like a homecoming, and I'm very happy to see the Institute have grown so much over this period of time. And I'm also very delighted that Professor John Harris is chairing this session. As he's like a teacher. I've been following his work over a long period of time. I've attended his lectures and so on. So in today's lecture, I would like to talk about some of the major changes in India's labor market, especially during the 2000s. And I'd also like to look at these changes in a larger context, against the backdrop of an argument that has somewhat become quite fashionable in recent times. The argument is that India, because of its large and young population, is going to derive a lot of economic benefits in the coming years. So is it working? Press yeah.
Yeah.
Go to slideshow. Can you go up to slideshow, Jayan? And
yeah, I think this can be done. Yeah, thank you. So the argument is that India has this demographic dividend because of this large and young population. What is this demographic dividend? And if you look at this graph, you can see that, essentially we are talking about a decline in the proportion of the very young in population. So you can see in China's case, somewhere around the mid-70s, there's been a sharp decline in fertility rates as well as in the proportion of the very young, 0 to 15 years. Thanks mainly to its one-child policy. And correspondingly, look at China's case, you see a great increase in its working age population. Sorry, before I go into this, I must also say that it's quite interesting from a personal point of view, or someone who grew up in India during the 1980s, to hear that population is the biggest asset for India. Because I remember most of my teachers during the 80s telling us that for India the biggest challenge is its large population. And without reducing its population, we cannot ever think of India having, being a developed country. Now the debate has kind of turned upside down. And I think even in the economic literature, there's a big change. 1968 there was a bestseller book titled The Population Bomb. And I think what changed this debate was probably the performance of first the East Asian countries, which was largely driven by the supply of educated, large increase in educated labor force, and now China. So this is China's case. What you see here is a sharp increase from the mid-70s in its working age population. So also now the debate is more not only about the size of the population, but about the structure of the population. If a population, if a country has a large working age population, then it has got much better economic prospects. But in some ways, one can also see that China's initial success in reducing its fertility rates is proving to be somewhat of a disadvantage now. One can see that China's population, working age population is declining. In fact, its old age population is rising at a rapid rate. One can also see that India's fertility transition or demographic transition occurred much later. The decline in fertility rates happened much later. But it says the demographic dividend, I mean, if you just look at these numbers, the World Bank numbers, I think that gives a very clear picture. This is 2010 and this is 2015. So for India, the working age population as per World Bank estimates is expected to rise from 757 to something like 1048 million, almost a 200 million increase. Whereas the working age population is projected to decline in most developed regions, and even in China, you can see a decline in the developed, in the working age population in China. So I think that is probably the essence of this excitement about India, because 200 million new working age people means possibly that would be the single largest contribution to the incremental global labor supply in the coming years. And of course, these are also large increase in consumers, which it's a huge market that is opening up. So I think that is the essence of this argument on demographic dividend. But is this excitement really justified? I think very clear. I mean, you have a working age population, but if the working age population is not actually working, then clearly you don't have a demographic dividend. So we have some evidence on what is happening on this front from India's national sample surveys, which are, these are a small note on the surveys. Sorry. Other than the census of India, which is conducted at an interval of every 10 years and covers the entire population, this is the largest statistical operation from the government of India. You have these are sample surveys, which means this is not the entire population. As you can see, the latest 11-12 surveyed something like 100,000 households. That is almost 450,000 individuals. And this is spread over 7,000 plus villages and 5,000 plus urban blocks, trying to get a measure of different regions of India. And we have similar surveys on expenditure, consumer expenditure, and that's the basis for poverty estimates. And of course, these surveys were held in 72, 73, 77. The latest rounds are 99, 2004-5, 2009-10, and 11-12. One can see that it's normally done at an interval of 5 years. But then this very interesting survey which was done in 11-12, there's a story behind it. I will just come to it. What do these surveys do? They actually, they help us get estimates of the activity status, whether a person is employed, whether a person is unemployed, student, and so on and so forth. And you also have the census figures on total population. So if you multiply the proportions that you get from NSS with the census population figures, you can actually get some reliable estimates in million, in numbers, of what is India's total labor force, what is India's workforce, and so on and so forth. So just to highlight a few points. First is that labor force is only 39.4% of the total population in India. And I think this is a very important number. If you just look at comparable figures for China or Brazil, it's something like 60%, or I mean, I'm coming to a comparison later, but it is much higher. The other point I want to note here is the numbers of unemployed. Only 11 million in a population of 1,000 plus, 1,200 plus. And now if you actually look at the conventional unemployment rate, which is unemployed as a proportion of labor force, which something like India has something like 2%. It's an extremely low unemployment rate. Amartya Sen had written once that India's unemployment rates are something which can put developed countries to shame. But I think this very table tells you the somewhat meaninglessness of these unemployment figures, because as you see here, the labor force is only 40% of the population, which means a large number of persons are outside the labor force, and unemployment is calculated only as a proportion of the labor force. So you don't actually look at persons who are outside the labor force, and they are in some ways they are unemployed. I mean, they don't want to enter the labor force. And I think one important number here is the numbers of persons who are attending to domestic duties. I shall come back to it. That is almost 19% of India's population in 11-12. But we are very interested in this particular figure, employed, numbers of who are working. And how has this changed over time? This is 11-12. Because we have figures for 93, 99, 2004, 5, 9, 10, and so on. So what these are in absolute numbers. So what I want to say here is that India's total workforce was something like 400 million in 99-2000. It increased by 59.5 million to something like 459 million by 2004-5. So these are incremental employment in absolute numbers. But if you look at this graph, I think you can see it's kind of a dramatic picture, what you see here. Just look at these two last columns. This shows the last 99 to 2004-5, 5-year period. India's workforce increased by 59.5 million. The next 5-year period, 2004-5 to 2009-10, that was actually a period of much faster growth. In fact, much of this excitement about India started after the mid-2000s. But if you look at the employment that was created, just 4.7 million. And this actually created a large, a lot of interest in the media. There were a lot of, many argued that this is jobless growth. There's a lot of interest on this. Now, I would like to argue in this paper that we need to look at these numbers more carefully to understand what they actually signify. I, in fact, mentioned at the beginning that, normally these surveys are conducted at an interval of 5 years, but 11-12 survey was, just 2 years after the previous survey. That, in one sense, the current the UPA government came to power in 2004-5. So the 2009-10 results were not something which the UPA government wanted to defend. So the 11-12 surveys, in many ways, considered, was perhaps to show that employment has actually improved. Because 9-10 was also a bad year. It was a drought year, and it was also the midst of the global financial crisis. So a lot of manufacturing employment lost during that period. But anyway, my argument is not that. I'm trying to actually show what these numbers signify. What I want to say is that this is total employment, which is actually employment in agriculture as well as employment in non-agricultural sectors. Now, we normally expect employment in agriculture to decline with economic development. And this has been the historical experience, starting with Britain to, China, including China now. And even in India, you would find the proportion of the workforce employed in agriculture declining over time. But we did not see the absolute number of persons employed in agriculture declining. In fact, very interestingly, the first half of the 2000s, 99 to 2004-5, the first half of the 2000s, you actually see an increase in absolute numbers of persons who are employed in agriculture. This was quite interesting because the first half of the 2000s was a period of where agricultural growth was statistically insignificant, And this is also generally considered to be a period where farmer suicides, the intensity of farmer suicides were very high. There was a, generally accepted that there was a rural distress. So how can agricultural employment rise during a period when agriculture is growing very slow? I think if you look more closely in these numbers, we find that almost the entire increase in agricultural employment during the first half was of females who are self-employed in agriculture. So the argument, many other scholars have also looked at this, and the argument is that this is distress employment. People who are not in the labor force earlier, they joined, they were compelled to join the agricultural workforce mainly because of to supplement household incomes. On the other hand, we see during the second half of the 2000s actual decline in agricultural employment, and much of this decline is of the decline of self-employed female workers. What could have happened after 2004-05? I think one important change, first thing is that agricultural growth, there was a modest recovery in agricultural growth after 2004-05. But the second more important thing was that there was a large expansion of public works in rural areas. And the most well-known thing is MNREGA, which is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Employment created through that. So you can see here that the employment created by public works, that is by government spending, government expenditure, was something like 0.9 million in 2004-05. It increased to 6.6 million in 2009-10. The increase after that was very marginal. In fact, the government is not really committed to it. But even with that little commitment, the impact it made in rural areas, I think, is substantial. I have shown in my paper that, especially for rural females, 2.8 million employment jobs through public works or government expenditure, and that accounted for almost 70% of the increase in employment for females during this period. And we can see the effect if you look at the wage growth. The wage growth during the first half was at the rate of 1.4. The second half, the wage growth increased quite substantially. So what I'm trying to say is that there has been some improvement in rural areas during the second half of the 2000s, and which probably must have led to a decline in the distress employment that was witnessed during the first half of the 2000s. But at the same time, we must mention that there are, agriculture is not doing well, and people are actually pushed out of agriculture as well. Two other points which I will come in more detail. One is an expansion of education. Because of that, you see a decline in agriculture population. So my first point here is that there's been an absolute decline in agricultural employment in India, starting in 2009-10. In fact, it's a very delayed kind of a transition from agriculture, if you look at the experience of other countries, including China. But still, it is now happening. So, in a way, in first half, the so-called jobless growth is mainly because of the second half, was because of a decline in agriculture and a modest increase in non-agricultural employment. So, in fact, I think now India should be probably looking at this number, non-agricultural employment, how much of it is being created. Because these are for different periods. Just look at the annual increase. This actually gives a comparison between the different. You can see here that in fact there's an improvement in the rate of growth of non-agricultural employment from 5.9 to 6.9 million after 2004-05. So clearly there is the argument that there is a jobless growth that is not justified. But I think my bigger question, and that I would like to ask in the second part of this presentation, is this enough? There's definitely a marginal improvement in non-agricultural employment, but is that enough? We've begun the presentation by saying that now there is an increase in working age population, and agriculture is no longer an employer, which means the increase, the incremental working age population will be looking for jobs in the non-agricultural sector. Now, in addition, you have actually people moving from agriculture and looking for jobs in the non-agricultural sector, which means the persons, there's a large increase in supply of workers who are ready to join the non-agricultural sector. And the question is are jobs being created in India at that rate? Another important interesting fact is an improvement in education that is happening since the 2000s. And with improvement in education, people's expectations of employment will also grow. But a short note about this point. India's record in education and schooling has always been much below the East Asian standards, and Amartya Sen and many others have written about it. You can see the average years of schooling that India attained in 2000 was what China attained in 1980, Indonesia attained in 1980, and Korea attained way back in 1960. But I think very interestingly there is an improvement after 2000s. You can see these are ratio of students to population, mainly in the primary school going age, secondary school going age, and 15 to 19 years. It's still not universal, but I think the improvement is very clear, from 60% to 87%. This is rural females, so the most disadvantaged group among all them. And I think particularly interesting is the improvement in school enrollment in educational institutions among rural women 15 to 19 years. Now almost more than 50% of rural women in 2011-12 were attending educational institutions. That's a big change from what it had been in 10 years back. And which probably means an improvement also in higher education to some extent. The other point to note is that this has occurred across, what the red lines, these are consumption expenditure deciles. That is, this is the poorest consumption expenditure group. This is the richest consumption expenditure group. So the red lines show the figures for 1999-2000. So you can see that the students as a proportion of population or student enrollment among the poorest groups was much less than among the richest group. But look at by 11-12 or 9-10, the disparity has almost gone down considerably. So I think this is a very positive feature that is happening in the Indian economy. But at the same time, it's also a challenge for policymakers to create that many new, better quality non-agricultural jobs. So the question is that being created? So we have some figures again. Between 2004-5 and 11-12, so the increase has been of 48 million new jobs. So that is a point. But I think my main point here is that almost 50% of that increase in non-agricultural job came from construction, no other sector. So that I think is the biggest problem with, and construction is generally of poor productivity, poor wages. You can say it's a low quality, in terms of productivity and wages, it's relatively much less jobs. And yes, there's been much excitement about this particular sector, financing, insurance, real estate and business services. This is also the sector which has IT. It increased by 5.8 million, which is substantial, of course, 5.8 million new jobs, 4-5 to 11-12. But I think, given the challenge that of, people who are ready to join such work, it's nothing, But the most important is manufacturing. Manufacturing has generated just 5 million jobs, which I think is an extremely poor performance. The other point is that, a large part of this non-agricultural employment was created in the so-called Bimari states, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, even West Bengal. These are all the states where employment creation has been, the first block shows the actual numbers. And a large part of this employment created in these states, UP, West Bengal, Bihar, is in construction. Now, I have, this is something which I would like to actually pursue even further, because as of now, it's very difficult to get data on how many of these are migrant workers. Because a large part of, a large increase in employment in these relatively poor states, and much of it in construction. So, is it that these are, and much of it is accounted in rural males. So this is something which I have to look further. This is a point which I already mentioned, but I just want to highlight that other than construction, these are rate of increase in 100,000 numbers, annual increase. So construction was an improvement, but in most other sectors, financing was an increase, but in other sectors, manufacturing, the rate of increase in job creation has actually declined. In all other sectors, it's a decline. This I think is far more important. These are proportions across population categories. Who all have got the employment. One can see that in construction, much of the employment has gone to male in rural areas. But in most other sectors, especially the high productivity sectors, much of the employment has gone to male in urban areas. And who are left out, clearly it's the female population who are left out. One can see that in IT, financing, insurance, real estate, business services, this includes IT, only 13% of the employment in 11-12 was only females, accounted for by females. Computer, I've particularly noted, it's only 15% of the employment in 11-12 females. Even public administration, government jobs, only 12% for females. The same picture for net increase in employment, almost the same picture. I'm not actually going to the details. So, the question I started with was, is the employment that is generated, is it enough given the changes that are happening in India's labor market? Changes means, 1, the increase in working age population, 2, the shift from agriculture, and 3, improvements in education. But at least we can, so we're getting some calculations. I'm almost done. There is, yeah. Yeah. Let's look at these numbers for rural males, A rural male who are in the 15 to 59 age group, the population increased by 32 million or 33 million between 2004-5 and 11-12. Now, of this, 16 million were students. So, so you have to create jobs for the rest, 32 minus 16, almost 16 million. But then you also have to create jobs for people who are leaving agriculture, that is 5.7. So 16 plus 5.7, that is almost 21. And you actually have the jobs created in the non-agricultural sector is actually almost that. So what I'm trying to say here, if you look at in rural males, there is not so much of a problem. The supply of workers. I'm clear here. It's. Do I need to? Is it clear? Okay. The supply of people who are ready to join non-agricultural work is almost the same as the actual numbers of non-agricultural jobs created. But the only problem is 21 million, almost 18 out of this 21 million is in construction, which, as I mentioned earlier, is very low wage, very poor working conditions, and so on. The other issue is, there's a 16.4 million increase in students during this period. And in the next period, they will be demanding much better jobs. They are not in the labor force at the moment because students are not part of the labor force. But in another 5 years or another 10 years, they are going to demand jobs. So the situation is going to really, change the demand for non-agricultural jobs is going to be much more in the coming years for India, in rural areas for male. Now look at the picture for females. I'm only showing for urban females. There's a clear, equally different picture, equally similar picture for rural females. Now the population of urban females in the 15 to 59 age group increased by 26 million, of which 6 million were students. So which means you have to create, one would expect non-agricultural jobs for something like 20 million urban females. In addition, you also have to create non-agricultural jobs for 1.5 million urban females who left agriculture. So 20 plus 21.5 million. So one would expect, the supply of urban females who are ready to work in industry and services has actually increased by 21.5 million between 2004-05 and 11-12. But just look at the numbers of the actual numbers of non-agricultural jobs created for urban women during this period. Less than 4 million. Which means there's a clear gap, between, between the people who are demanding jobs and people who are actually getting jobs. So what is happening to the rest? NSSO reports that 17.6 million of them, this incremental population, they are attending domestic duties, which means they are not in the labor force, and which also means they are not counted as part of unemployment, because unemployment is counted only if you are, if you say that I am looking for a job. But NSSO reports that these women are not looking for jobs, they are attending to domestic duties. So I think this is a huge challenge for India, and this I believe is where India is going to fail in its in its whether India is going to reap its demographic dividend, certainly not. At least the female side of it, certainly not. I have, yeah. I'll just,
No, you've got 5-10 minutes.
yeah, yeah, almost, yeah. I only need to kind of elaborate this point a little more. You can see labor participation rate, that is economically active population as a proportion of 15 plus population. The figure I showed earlier was for the entire population. So you can see India's total figure is 56, the earlier figure was 40. So don't worry. I think the main point is that the Indian figure is much less than many of the other countries. Look at the female participation rates, 29% in India compared to China, which is 64, Singapore, which is 59. Among South Asian countries, Bangladesh has done fairly well, 57%, whereas Pakistan has done even worse than India, 24%. Sri Lanka is 35%, and so on. So this is a record. Just to, because female participation, there's also literature on this. The argument is that your female participation rate is likely to be higher when your incomes are lower, then it rises, and again when your incomes are higher, there's something like a U shape. But what I'm trying to show here is India's female participation is even lower than what one would expect given its income level. Again, some historical experience, you can see that much of East Asia, the increase in labor force I mentioned at the beginning came from increase in female labor force. Much of it, of course. In South Korea, increase 36 to 47, Singapore less than 30 to 53. And of course, there's a large literature on women participating in East Asian industrialization. Of course, it also, it was not always good employment. Many of them had to work for long hours. Wages were, in South Korea, for instance, Alice Armstrong argues that the wage differential between male and female workers was extremely high. But I think still there was more economic participation. Whereas in India's case, like 20 years after reforms, you don't actually see an improvement in female labor participation. Just two more points and through. I want to also show that those who are attending to domestic duties is very high among educated women. It's also very high among women who are in the richer groups, richer how, those who are attending domestic duties, it's rising, and this is from the poorer consumption groups to the richer consumption groups. The last number, if you just look at calculate the numbers, those who are attending domestic duties in 2009-10, it was as big as 216 million. Just to get a sense of that number, it's as big as the population of Russia, or almost as big as the population of Brazil. These are entire countries, and entire populations of entire countries. And not all of them are illiterate or, the population with graduate degrees was 12 million, which is more than the population of a country like Singapore. So I think this is the dimension of the problem. I kind of want to conclude. What I was trying to say in this presentation was that there are some important changes in India's labor market, especially during the 2000s. One is an increase in working age population, which is actually both an opportunity, the so-called demographic dividend, and also a big challenge for policymakers. Agriculture is now no longer an employment generator. In fact, people are moving out of agriculture. There's a positive feature about Indian development that is happening during the 2000s, which is an improvement in education, not only in the higher primary or secondary level, but even at the higher secondary level. But each of these are going to create more challenges, because with education, aspirations for better productivity jobs are going to increase. If you just look at the past record of the past 7 years, it's a very disappointing picture. It has improved. Compared to the previous years, the rate of employment growth has improved, but much of it is in construction. Bulk of the high productivity jobs for urban males, and who are lost out, mainly females and rural areas, are left out in this. Thank you. I will wait for your comments and questions. Thank you so much.